Hello out there. Welcome to another live stream here from AutoCrit. If you're not familiar with AutoCrit, we are a premier source for authors. We have our writing desk, which is an online platform which allows you to plan, write, and edit your work. We have our online community. We have our academy page, which has all kinds of courses, including a romance course, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And we're talking about romance today. How to make romance better. Now, the tips I'm going to be discussing today really work if you're working in the romance genre or not, although we will speak a little bit specifically to the romance genre just to start out with. But don't worry if you don't write romance genre. If you just write a romance subplot, we're going to discuss you as well. So one thing you want to do if you are writing in the romance genre is you need to know the rules of the genre. This is something that our members know. We just did a little romance section for our members as well. And so know the rules of the genre. What are the rules of the romance genre? Well, one is you need to have an HEA or HFN. That is happily ever after or happily for now. Now, happily ever after, everything is all hunky-dory. The couple is going to go off into the sunset, and the implication is nothing bad is ever going to happen. Happily for now means, well, they're settling, but everything is looking good for the moment. Both are acceptable. What you cannot do is have a tragic ending, not in the romance genre. Now, you might be saying, well, what about something like The Notebook or The Fault in Our Stars? Well, technically speaking, those are not in the traditional sense romance genre. Those are not going to be the ones that are going to be categorized on Amazon in romance, typically sold in the bookstore next to the other romance novels. Those are considered dramas and things like that. And so do not mix that up. If you do, what will happen is somebody will pick up your book and they'll assume, oh, it's getting bad, but it's going to work out. It always works out. And then if it doesn't, they will hate you. Romance as a genre is a comfort genre. It's a genre that people read when they're looking for a nice warm hug, right? So if you give them kind of a bitter ending, yeah, it's not going to work well at all. Another thing you can have is no cheating, nothing like that. No. These sort of things, especially from any character you're supposed to care about, is going to put off the readers in a hurry. This is not something they're going to forgive. So you cannot have they weren't completely faithful, but we're going to make the relationship work. No, this is not part of the romance genre. Again, this is a comfort genre. And even though relationships can recover from this at times, this is not something romance likes to explore. So now you might say, well, what about, an evil character? Can an evil character do it? Can the wrong person do it? Yes, that can in fact happen. However, even that, it just tends to be such a third rail thing. It tends to be such a triggering thing for people. They often do not like it even in that context. So it's generally best avoided if you can. You might have a tragic backstory for a character where, they were cheated on or something like that, perhaps, but probably, not the best idea. Can cheating be part of the backstory? Yeah, like I said, that's a dangerous thing to do. Can they be tempted to cheat? Again, that's rather dangerous to do. That's a very off-putting thing, and that is not something I would really recommend. But what about the love triangle? Well, I would say love triangles traditionally in romance are not, in fact, cheating because at the point in which the love triangle takes place, the actual relationship has not solidified, and so therefore it's not really a cheating situation. It's kind of, you have a bunch of friends, maybe you're going to get a little bit further with it. You haven't quite made that break into being a full-fledged relationship, and you're kind of jockeying for position as to who that is, right? So that can happen. Or they can break up with somebody and then they can be with somebody else. That's okay. That's also not cheating. Just getting a lot of fast and furious questions here. Can tragedy at the end of a book lead into a second? Not in romance, right? You do need a happily for now. So yes, you can have happily for now, which means there might be a problem on the horizon, which in that case you could put in the second book, but it would have to be happy for now. a really bad cliffhanger is a risky thing to do in romance and generally is not acceptable. That is considered bad form. You will get docked. You will see reviews where people will dock people for that. They'll be like, I don't like this, and I ended in a cliffhanger. You can have a cliffhanger of happily for now cliffhanger, but that's about it in the traditional genre. What is the divide between erotic and romance? Well, that gets to like heat level, right? What is that heat level of, what kind of content you're covering? And that's going to be based on the audience. There are, in fact, steamy romances that are basically on the edge of something like erotica because they have that much, adult content. There's also, sweet romance, G-rated romance where sexual activity is not even mentioned. So that is an audience thing. But again, that's something to keep in mind. Is a stolen kiss at the moment cheating? Again, tricky stuff. Would this be a matter of recategorizing your genre or rewriting the book? That's a good question, right? So what if you have written a romantic story and it violated some of these rules? I would say you have a choice, right? If you feel like you could, in fact, rewrite it with a happy ending and it wouldn't destroy the story, then maybe you should. However, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you should stick with your tragic ending. And now it's women's fiction, it's drama, it's something else. Yeah, that's up to you, really, as an author. You want to root for success for the couple, right? This is what romance is about in its core form. There are other dramatic stories that have romantic components to it. Think about well, that's not the best example, but what you want is romance is they're motivated by being in a relationship with somebody else. And that is the main plot of the story, right? And a lot of other categories, it might be a subplot, but it's not that important, right? It's just kind of a way to add some characterization. It's a way to add some extra color, things like that. Ooh, are there particularly good places to submit romance short stories for publication or awards? It's good you asked that. We are always putting in publishing opportunities that we're aware of in the AutoCrit community. So if you are an AutoCrit member, slide on over to the community, look for publication notices, and that'll be a great resource for that. Knowing the heat level, again, this was somebody was asking about erotica versus romance, right? The last thing you want is for somebody to pick up your book and then be off put by how explicit you are, right? Because then they're going to give you a rotten review, or likewise pick up your book and expect something hot and heavy and not get it. So there are different ways you could position it. Of course, we know book covers, right? There's a very big difference between a sweet romance book cover and a steamy romance book cover. And there's also just the way you write the story in general. Erotica tends to be rougher in many ways, language, things like that. Not wanting to write many HEAs is what pushes me to do romance as a subplot only for most books. Yeah, and that's fine. If you don't want to write that kind of comfort food work, it's like a chef. A chef doesn't have to make a burger if they don't want to. There's nothing wrong with chefs that make gourmet burgers, right? They have a purpose. But if you do not want to do that, then don't do that. Do use those ingredients and do something else with them. For sure. You can feel boxed into an HEA. And if you do, then that might mean the romance genre is not for you, right? Because you should love it. You should love what you do. So if you don't love creating this wish fulfillment, this wonderful happy ending for your reader and give them that wonderful moment where everything kind of, everything works out and it's a beautiful thing and they're crying and all of that because it's just, such a wonderful thing. If that's not what you want to evoke in your audience, if you want to evoke more of a melancholy sort of feel, that's fine. Just different genre. All right. Speaking of the heat level, you also have the moral level. This usually comes hand in hand. G-rated romances generally don't have morally ambiguous characters because the same kind of audience because again, you're looking for that comfort, right? Somebody who wants to read like an Amish romance probably isn't looking for a lot of moral ambiguity in the world. One reason why that's a subgenre that's so popular is because you're dealing with a group of people that have such clear moral guidelines. And to some degree, maybe you wish the world was more like that. Even if it were Amish, you might be wishing that, the world was more black and white. It was less confusing for you. And so that's the comforting food you want. Therefore, to have characters act morally gray in that is not going to work very well. So even beyond just the heat level, you have to, change the morally gray. You can't go morally gray either. Am I the only one who loves a happy ever after because the world is already complicated enough? No, I love a happily ever after. I do have no problem with the traditional romance genre when it is done well, for sure. Something, there is something to a simple story in many ways, moral, black and white, the good guys and the bad guys and all of that. Yeah, that's very nice to see. The main plot must be the relationship, as I said, and the obstacles should be understandable. In which case, I mean, the obstacles should be something that the audience can relate to, they can understand and track. You don't want it to be something that just comes in at the last minute just to create a lot of trouble, because that's going to be contrived. We all know if you make a relationship the situation, something has to be problematic about the relationship or about getting from point A to point B, right? And if it's some kind of contrived thing that we don't relate to, yeah, that's not going to work out very well at all. And yes, you can have drama with HFN in romantic suspense. Correct. That is one reason for the happily for now, right? If you don't want everything to work out, the HFN allows you to still have a satisfying, happy ending. It's not a cliffhanger, but it is a little bit more melancholy, right? You know that there might be a problem in the future, even though for now it is working out. All right. So one thing you want to make sure you do is you build tension throughout your story. You do not want a flat relationship. As much as it's fun to write, love at first sight and everything's hunky dory. Well, if the main plot is the relationship, this generally doesn't work well. Where you tend to see love at first sight plots work well is when they're a subplot, right? Because then you don't want to take a lot of time to make the relationship work. It's just, well, the relationship works, and now something else is putting it in jeopardy, which is usually the actual main plot. It's a war plot, it's a fantasy plot, it's a sci-fi plot, separation, things like that. In romance, usually the relationship's going to ebb and flow. It's going to be a little bit will they, won't they. You are going to build suspense throughout. If this is a steamy romance, of course, you're building suspense as to when they're going to have physical relations of any sort, right? If it's more of a G-rated romance, then it's when they are going to fully commit to each other. Typically, it typically ends with some sort of full commitment, be it proposal or marriage or something like that. And just like every other plot, you really need to follow the basic guidelines. This is guidelines that we've talked about, on this stream before. But you're going to have that hook. In a relationship, it's going to be whatever is that initial attractor, right? Whatever is making them work out well for each other. Or it could be whatever is putting them with each other. Maybe it's a hate to love situation. So it's kind of like, what is forcing them together. And then you have a question. The question in a romance is related to what might break them up, right? How are they going to overcome X is really the question. And the X can be whatever. But generally speaking, it's just one question you're asking in a romance. Very simple. Then they make a decision to go ahead with the relationship, right? Either they're pursuing it, they're considering it, or they're actually doing it. It depends on the structure of the romance and what you're doing with that. You have the fun and games with the back and forth in the romantic relationship. It goes up, it goes down, it kind of floats around, things like that. And then you have a disaster where the relationship looks like it's never going to work out in a million years because whatever you were questioning is now rearing its head, right? And whatever was the risk in the decision is now rearing its head. The reason why they wouldn't get together is now a problem. And how are they going to get past it? Which is the solution to the question. So it's like, how in the world will they ever overcome X? And then you have an answer. And then you have the new world, which is them looking at the world with new eyes because the relationship matters. It's not just a matter of pairing your characters off with somebody. In romance, well, really, in general, you should make this happen. But specifically in romance, the relationship does change the way they view the world because they have growth as a character. Otherwise, what's the point of writing about it, right? It's not that exciting. And really, relationships do change us. So that's not exactly a surprise, right? So what you want to demonstrate to the audience is how it changed their life. In a happily ever after, it's how they changed their life for the better. Often sunshine, lollipops, rainbows, all those things, depending on how over the top you want to make it. Everything is so much better. It's so beautiful. And it's just a lovely ending. Happily for now, it might be a little bit more mixed. There's certain things about life that's gotten better, certain things that are maybe more complicated, but overall, they are happier for the relationship. How much fun and game can you put in a book without it getting too caught up in the scene instead of pushing on with the plot? That's a really great question, right? Because that's where you can have what's called the second act sag, right? Because it's essentially a flat line, right? In theory, because once you get to the decision, and it's like there's a risk, right? And they're like, you could have a relationship, but this might happen. Well, then it's just like time, and then this happens, right? And so how long that time is before this happens, it's kind of up to you. It generally is, though, a lot of the story, which is why tension is so important. And you gotta keep reminding people of that disaster that imminently could happen. It's kind of like you think about Titanic and the iceberg, right? You gotta set it up that it's like, something is going to happen, and something's going to happen, and you keep just waiting for it to happen. And so when it does, it's a pretty big deal. Of course, the thing about Titanic actually is that the true disaster doesn't even happen until later because it keeps escalating. It gets worse and worse and worse. It's really like the midpoint. So you can have something bad happen in the midpoint. See, I'm kind of undoing my own structure, but this is good. Let's get more nuanced. You can have something kind of bad happen in the midpoint. An example is Pride and Prejudice. The midpoint is really when Darcy proposes and she says, well, you're the last person I'd ever want to marry. You might be like, oh, that's the end of the relationship, right? But it's not. There's still some fun and games. There's some back and forth. She visits his house. She learns more about him. There's letters exchanged and whatever. The disaster is really when she feels like what her sister has done has basically prevented him from ever being interested in her, because now his concerns about her family are completely merited and it's never going to work out. And now she actually cares about the relationship not working out, right? And so that's the true disaster. So you can have escalation. The fun and games doesn't just have to be, back and forth, everything happy-go-lucky. You generally do have a midpoint where something shifts, and then you kind of shift gears into the disaster. Excuse me. Often, the midpoint is when one of the characters has decided they actually want the relationship to work. Now, it could be that both of them decide early on, but usually not. Usually, there's one character that's more on board for the relationship than the other. Okay? And that's, again, it's often how it happens in life. One person's a little more aggressive than the other, and then you both kind of come to an understanding. So the midpoint is usually when both people are on board and they're like, or they're both moving towards a relationship. And then the disaster is that final thing they have to overcome, right? But they have shifted from before the middle point. You're like, well, they're going to work out because you've read this book before. But in the world, they wouldn't actually know that. All right. So you want to keep that tension going. And when it comes to, a more steamy sort of thing, you need to keep that in mind too. You don't want to necessarily just rush into a hot and heavy scene, because then it's like, well, where do you have to go? Right. And G-rated stuff is like, you don't want to rush into them confessing feelings for one another or things like that, because there's really nowhere to go. I used to make fun of Hallmark because they felt too simple. These 2 sessions have made me realize you just didn't understand. Yes. There's a reason why this is the most successful financial genre, why there can be complete channels of essentially the same story over and over again. There is something going on underneath the surface that is more complex than some people give it credit for. And I'll give it credit for it. It is a very difficult thing to actually do well. You could argue, well, does something like Hallmark do it well because it's so formulaic? Well, it's certainly very successful. People consume it. People enjoy it. So yes, for reaching its audience. And if you're not the audience, that just means you're not the audience, right? It's something to be keep in mind. Why shouldn't they be together is really kind of the big question. And if you can make this interesting, you're better off than a lot. A lot of people will come up with contrived reasons why the couple can't be together, because where they get very excited is talking about the characters. They can imagine, the protagonist and the love interest and everything going well with them. What they can't imagine as easily is why they shouldn't be together. So try to keep that in mind and try to make it interesting, compelling, and realistic, because that really does help. And it doesn't have to be like super dramatic either. It doesn't have to be like, somebody has to really forgive somebody of something horrible or something like that. Because again, it's a comfort genre. So it's challenging. There's like, in some ways, it's one of the most challenging genres to write because there are a lot of rules. And so that means as a creative person, you have to play within a strict sort of, metric. But kind of similar to like poetry and how there's things like free verse and there's things like limericks, there's things like haiku, the rules don't necessarily keep you from making good art. That's all I'm going to say on that. All right. Something else to keep in mind when you have romance is you don't just have to have romance in your romance, right? People don't just read romance to talk about romantic feelings. There are other things you can talk about. In fact, it's very common to have other things going on in a romance. You can have subplots. You can have a mystery subplot or a suspense subplot or a comedic subplot. All different kinds of things about a story can make it more interesting. It can strengthen your characters. And another thing subplots can do, let's get back to that second act sag problem, right? In the fun and games, subplots can make the fun and games more interesting because the subplot can give your character something else to do besides work on their relationship. And it can kind of distract the audience for a bit while the relationship goes on hold. And nothing wrong with that. Often they call it the B story, right? And the A story kind of slows down, the A story picks up, and then they come back together. And the subplot can directly relate to the main plot, but it doesn't have to. You also have side characters. If you want to talk about a series, this is a great way to do a series. It's becoming more and more prevalent where characters who are side characters, the person often, a common trope is somebody has like kind of the desperate single friend who's like the comic relief. And the sequel could be, well, they're finally going to find love, right? Isn't that nice? In the meantime, they kind of help play matchmaker. They're often what I call the relationship character. Go back to some of my other videos on that. They explain the world to the main character. But they can often be something you can use in a second book. Because writing a sequel to a romance is really hard. Because if you're saying happily ever after, well, you can't undo that, or you're kind of cheating the audience. You're saying, well, it really wasn't happily ever after, was it? And then if you do happily for now, well, you can't make the it too dramatic because it still undermines it. Not to mention, it's not very wish fulfillment-ish to have too many problems really affect the relationship itself. Right? Because if the relationship itself is constantly at jeopardy, that's kind of a rocky relationship. And that's not exactly what you read for wish fulfillment. That might feel like real life, but it's not very fantastical or comforting to think of a relationship like that. Epiphany moment. I finally understood what A and B plots are. Fantastic. That's what we like to do here at Autocrit. Too many friends have been dumped via text message. Is that from personal experience or is that in fiction? I love giving side characters in my novels their own POV and it's a great thing to do, right? Another thing you can do is if your subplot of your world is interesting, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, you can grow that into another story. The other thing, of course, is that people in romance should not only be motivated by romance. It might be their primary thing they're concerned about in the story, and there's nothing wrong with that. Right? There's nothing wrong with somebody's primary concern for the purpose of story being that the relationship will work out or not, right? Because we all know in life there are times that we get hyper-focused in that, even though there are other concerns of that. That might continue to be our biggest concern, right? Is our relationships with others. But certainly nothing wrong with that. However, that's not the only thing they're motivated by, right? They're going to be motivated by plenty of other things, some existential question about life, how do they find fulfillment just as their own person? So many other things can be going on at the same time. Side quests, yes. Similar to subplots, right? This is where the main characters just go off on a journey. These can be very dangerous because they can feel like, well, it's a waste of our time. Who cares, right? Because often a side quest can feel like just that you're just biding your time. It feels like an RPG where it's like you go and collect the gems so you can get through the door, and you're like, okay, and you do some medial task. But you can make them interesting. The concern with anything like this, like a side quest or subplot, is that if you have them and they're too interesting, you're going to wonder why it's not the main plot. But if they're not interesting enough, you're going to not wonder why they're not even there. So it can be a little bit challenging to write, but worthwhile to consider. One thing that can plague romance, just like any other genre, but particularly romance, is bland dialogue. And one reason why I think particularly it happens in romance is because romance is a slice of life sort of genre a lot of the time. It represents something close to reality. And so you have a tendency to make the dialogue less interesting and more realistic. And that's not very interesting. You know, um, the truth be told is that actual romantic dialogue is very strange to listen to from the outside. It often is kind of off-putting because it's quirky and weird and very self-involved, at least from my personal experience. On the other hand, the generic sort of, I don't want to say Shakespearean because that's obviously beautiful dialogue, but very purple. It's not bland though. On the other hand, when you try to just make it matter of fact, it doesn't sound very realistic and it sounds boring. One thing that you can do to avoid this is have a lot of disagreement. And what I mean by that is not just constant back and forth. It's like, I like apples. Well, I like oranges. Well, I like, no, I don't mean that, but even subtle disagreement. So, for example, if the guy comes in and he says, wow, that's a beautiful dress. And she's like, oh, this old thing? That's a little bit of disagreement, right? And that tells you something about the orientation. Whereas if she just said, oh, thank you, well, the conversation didn't really go anywhere, right? So just little disagreements can make a big difference. And it can tell something more about the character, right? When you have him say, it's a beautiful dress, and she says, oh, this old thing, it implies perhaps she either doesn't have good perception of herself, she's kind of undercutting herself too much. Perhaps she is demonstrating that he's not really clued into the fact that it's an old-fashioned sort of outfit, and and she doesn't really care that much about her appearance, and he's just complimenting her no matter what. There's varying levels, and the more dialogue you can figure out what that subtext is. But you can include that subtext with disagreement versus just having, you're beautiful. Yes, I know, like the Star Wars example. Although that's great because that's not the common answer to that. That gets to diction, right? Having your characters speak differently from one another. This is particularly helpful for the main character and their love interest. I'm not saying that opposites always have to attract, but the more different you can make their diction, the better off they are in terms of being trackable. And also, it tends to make conversations more interesting. So if somebody tends to be more blunt and somebody tends to be more diplomatic, somebody tends to be more aggressive, somebody's more passive, somebody is more optimistic, somebody's more pessimistic, think of those sort of things. And particularly when you get to your secondary characters, that's when you can get quite dramatic. We all know the standard kind of sidekick in a romance is the friend, and they're often a rather quirky character. And that can be very helpful to have, because it's just a different sort of voice that comes in to explain the situation. They don't sound like anybody else. There is the old school of thought, which is all of your characters should be so distinct from one another that you can tell the difference without reading the dialogue tag. And that's a bit of an extreme example, but yes, this is something that you should strive for. Can a subplot at the beginning morph into the main plot? In a romance, no, unless the romance is the subplot. But it's not really going to fool you, right? Because you're going to be like, well, you're reading a romance. So you know that even though the main character may not start out looking for a relationship, which is plenty of romances, right? Maybe the character starts out looking for, I don't know, a job promotion, right? And then she meets this other person, and then they come in, and that overwhelms the story. Yeah, that's pretty common. But we're not going to assume that it's we're not going to be fooled by it in a romance. We know what story we're signing up for. That's one of the challenges of romance, and one of the cool things about it. I like a challenge. Catchphrases, yeah, these sort of things can be helpful. Just different ways that people talk. And it doesn't have to be a catchphrase like the, I'll be back sort of thing. It could just be simple things, just simple ways that people communicate with one another. Different quirks about them that come out in their speech. And of course, subtext. We often, especially when it comes to emotions, do not talk to our emotions in text. We talk about them in subtext. It is specifically difficult to, express affection for somebody when you don't know if it's returned or not. So there's a lot of this dancing around. And if you miss that, you lose a lot of chance for some fantastic dialogue, some fantastic tension. Sexual subtext is all over romance in terms of the dialogue, right? People will talk about things and it's like, that's not really what they're talking about. And subtext doesn't have to be like covert, like it's like, well, I don't know, is the audience going to figure this out or not? No, I mean, it could be where even any idiot would know what the subtext is. However, even though we know everybody knows exactly what we mean, we still use subtext anyway. We still can dance around things, right? It's like, we're gonna, I'm gonna spend the night Netflix and chill. We all know what the subtext is, but we will say that versus the other because the other is considered a bit much. And there's just all different kinds of examples of that. And that's something that can be really helpful to include in your dialogue. It not only makes it more realistic, it makes it a lot more interesting. Now, don't forget the setting. It's so easy to make romance in like a white room, right? It's like romance. It's in a standard, village or, standard community. It's, in the suburbs. They have to commute 30 minutes to work. Like, you can just make it so milquetoast and boring. And it's because, well, why does the setting need to be that interesting? It's all about the characters. True. But setting affects the characters, and setting can, in fact, affect the entire tone of a work. You can certainly have a beautiful setting, right? Kind of the on-the-nose romantic setting, and it's like, well, no wonder they fall in love. It's such a romantic environment. Yeah, nothing wrong with that. That's especially helpful for the wish fulfillment, right? The wish fulfillment, the comfort, somebody meets somebody on vacation, things like that. Hallmark is all over settings. Yes, there's a reason why the Christmas genre is so popular. We have so much strong sentimentality connected around the holidays. So yes, don't neglect that, right? And there are some settings that perhaps are underutilized that are still wonderfully romantic that you could incorporate. So you have the on the nose idea, but you also have a paradox idea, right? You have that you can have the setting be somewhat at odds, where they're finding romance despite the setting is not particularly what you would want. You have to be careful with this because, again, this is a wish fulfillment genre, right? So, while two people who work at a garbage dump getting together might be kind of fun, that might be a little bit challenging to pull off. On the other hand, there might be something beautifully romantic about finding romance even in unlikely settings, right? So something to consider. This works generally better, I think, as a scene than it does as like a whole book, right? There's certainly scenes where in the midst of chaos, they find each other, right? Everything is terrible. It's a crowded restaurant. Everybody's yelling at each other and they don't really care because they have a meet cute in that sort of scenario. That's pretty common. Love at first sight at a funeral. There's a wonderful scene like that. I've seen that done well, for sure. So yes, exactly. It can also create a less sickly sweet sort of feeling if you have that sort of paradox, right? So if it's that, sure, they have this wonderful, strong connection, but the setting is not quite is kind of at odds with it, then it starts to feel less too perfect, right? It just depends. Quirky, yes. Like, what about just a funny setting, right? They meet at like a mini golf course, not particularly unromantic or romantic, just kind of quirky, bowling alley, things like that. Sure. This can also be fun to create some characterization. So I think of like the movie Return to Me, fun romantic movie where the character works at a Italian Irish restaurant. It's just kind of quirky. Those kind of fun little quirks make it feel more individual and also gives the characters an opportunity to talk about something else, right? they talk about the Bechdel test or Bechdel test. I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, but it's the comic artist, I believe. She came up with the test for female characters, and it's, do you have two characters that are female in your book? Do they speak to one another, and do they speak about something other than a man? right? And that's kind of a test to see if you have female representation. But that's something you need to keep in mind with your romance, right? I go back to not everything has to be about the romance. So if you make a quirky setting, well, you have something else for them to talk about that isn't just the romance. It's the reaction to the weirdness going on. You wanted to write a romance that starts off with an intense conversation, only to find out it's because the woman has a bomb strapped to her and the guy's talking to keep her distracted. That is pretty funny. I mean, and that kind of over the top thing, there's all different kinds of genre. There's romantic comedy, some of them can get kind of outlandish because, and you say it doesn't explode, right? You could put people in pretty extreme situations, and as long as it works out and the audience is pretty clear it's going to work out, they can have a lot of fun with it, right? Sure. How outlandish you can make it somewhat depends on the audience, because some people don't want stuff that's too fantastical. But again, I think there's wiggle room there. There's one reason why there's a lot of, paranormal romance crossover and things like that, for sure. Subplots. Yes, the setting itself can be a subplot. We're going to lose the rights to the place. That's a common one. It's the family farm and we can't raise enough money. Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about it is that it gives, again, the character something to do besides the romance. Something else is at stake that matters. And that's something that you do not have to solve the exact way the audience might expect, because what they care mostly about is the romance. So when the family farm is up for jeopardy, more than likely they're going to keep it, but they don't have to, right? You can have it where they lose it, but yet they work out something else that's maybe just as good. They discover something about themselves. They didn't always like, I never really liked the farm anyway or something. I don't know. But there's other ways that it involve itself. So it gives you an unpredictable plot, considering the main plot is going to be pretty predictable. However, settings can, in fact, be distracting. This can happen particularly when people are trying to do crossovers in the genres. So if you're writing a paranormal fantasy romance, be careful that actually what you're writing is a fantasy paranormal romance and not a fantasy paranormal with romantic elements. Two different things. Why does this matter? Does it matter for the success of your story? No, but it matters for the success of finding your audience. Right? You need to know who you're writing for. If you're writing for people who are interested in romance, again, the main thrust of the story needs to be the relationship. So if you're so, bent up on the world building around them, and the reason why they can't get together is some elaborate magic system, and there's all these fantasy elements and all that, that's a beautiful thing. What you probably have is not a romance. It just depends. But what you often have is actually a fantasy that just has romantic elements. And that also frees you up, though. You can decide, how it works itself out. Although probably it's still going to end up happily, because it's still pretty common. All right. So speaking of romance, we do have a upcoming writing course about romance, Penning Passion, which begins on Monday. If you would like to join us for that, you can, of course, sign up below. It is not going to be taught by me, although I will, in fact, be there. It is going to be taught by a romance author, Kara Crescent. I'm very excited to have Kara on board. Even though I have written a little bit of romance, I've dabbled a little bit in it, it's great to have an award-winning author on board to teach that course. And another voice for autocrit. So that is fantastic. In fact, all right, so let me kind of go into some of the things that Penning Passion is going to have to offer. We are going to be discussing the science and psychology of romance. So this one is a great look, because we're going to talk about psychological needs with human beings and how that factors into a romance genre. How do you ratchet up that tension? We're really going to get down to the bare bones of what it takes to make a compelling relationship, and also the stages of intimacy, right? There's a certain order that tends to transpire in terms of the way that people physically interact with one another. And so that could be helpful to know. Characters. Yes, characters are super important, right? We have the stock characters, but is there a way to make them more interesting and individualistic to yourself? Yes. Can you give them more personality? Of course you can. And it really matters a lot to make sure that you get that right. It's at the heart of romance. And speaking of the heart of romance, connection. We're going to talk about beyond just characters. How do you make them link together? And how do you create that chemistry between them? And we're going to finish up with putting the best foot forward, just kind of putting all the elements together, how to make the endings really land, plot devices to consider, all of these fun bits. Now, there will be live lectures starting on Monday. However, you can always watch the live lectures on a replay. And there will be course content as well to go in with that. Woohoo! We've got some people signed up. Is the course free to lifetime members? It is not. We will continue to offer the member-only workshops and things like that. However, these special courses are, in fact, an additional cost, partly because we're getting the live guests and things like that. All right, speaking of live guests, I'm going to see if I can get this audio to work for me and hear a little bit from Kara herself. All right, let's see if this works.
Hey everybody, I'm Kara Crescent, author of the Originals trilogy and the Last of Our Heroes series, and I am super excited about our upcoming course, Penning Passion. We are going to learn about all things romance, from writing heroines that our readers will want to be BFFs with, to heroes that they will want so much more from, and of course, how to write tension in their budding romance. Now, this course is for consenting adults because we are going to be talking about everything from how to write that perfect kiss to which euphemisms we can use in which heat levels. And of course, we will be using some dirty, dirty words. Words like tropes and formula. So come join me on Monday evening starting March 20th, and let's get your romance on. And don't worry, I'll be gentle.
As you can see, lots of personality, playful. I love Kara, and I'm so excited this and joining. I'm excited to join in on these conversations. Let me be honest; it's a lot of fun. So yes, I'll go ahead and throw that in. If you haven't signed up, go ahead and sign up for Penning Passion. I threw it in the chat as well. I'll go ahead and do that again. And of course, continue to keep subscribe, hit the bell, like this video, because we're going to have more videos about how to write as well right here on this channel, just like always. Now, for those pro AutoCrit members, don't forget, we have our fantasy club. We have our fantasy club tonight. We're going to be discussing magic systems. Yes, it's going to be really fun. Hard magic systems, not ones that are difficult, but just ones that are highly developed. What do you do with that? How do you keep that sense of wonder? Horror Club tomorrow, 6 p.m. Eastern. It's fantasy is 7 p.m. Eastern tonight. So if you're an AutoCrit member, just check out the schedule. If you're not an AutoCrit member, become an AutoCrit member. It's awesome. Autocrit.com. You can become an AutoCrit member. We have our accountability clubs on Monday. I have been so impressed with the accountability of everybody in AutoCrit. It's been fantastic to see everybody's development and work, and it's fun. I mean, you can come in, you can be like, I've been having a lousy week, and we're like, oh, we're going to turn that around. We're going to give you a little writing sprint, some energy, get those creative juices flowing, and get you right back. And yeah, somebody turns it around and they have a bad week and they come back in, and then the next week they're off the charts. And I just love that. That's what we're here for. We are here to make everybody better writers. Yeah, well, I don't blame you. I don't blame you at all. You might need to check out the fantasy club tonight. You should. Why not? We're nice. And if you don't write fantasy, that's okay too. Hard magic systems and the rules for such really apply to anything that is a world-related system of fantastical elements. That's a terrible way of putting it, but like technology and sci-fi is very similar and things like that. You're improving, definitely. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Oh, you're very welcome, Cecilia. I hope you liked and subscribed, and if you're not an AutoCrit member, that you look into that. I had a story ending last night that I had absolutely no idea that was going to happen. I love that when that happens, right? It's just like out of the blue. It's like an epiphany. What? It's great. It's so good. So anyway, I will see you around the AutoCrit community. Thank you so much for joining me yet again. Fantasy Club, always a blast. Yeah, so join us for that. And next week we're going to do some more inside AutoCrit, talk about some of the nitty gritty aspects of writing. So join me for that next week on YouTube. Definitely excited about that. And I will see you around the AutoCrit community. Bye.